So the title is Faith-Based / Spiritual Meaning and Purpose in Recovery. So what I hope to do is I'm going to be talking to you as the counselor more in this presentation than I am about the person in recovery, because we are the foundation, and developing the therapeutic relationship is very, very important. And I have gone through, just so you know, 9 years of theological / psychological education in college, seminary, and graduate school, and started out in a field many years ago called pastoral counseling. So I feel more than qualified to do this particular presentation based on my education and background and experience, but it's going to be a different twist probably than maybe what you expected. Several years ago, I don't know how many years ago, 20, 25, maybe longer ago, a concept came out and people were advertising themselves as Christian counselors. Well, you see people advertising themselves as Christian plumbers and about everything else on the planet. And my bias is that term has never stuck well with me, and that as an individual who's licensed by the state, and all of you are as well, we have an obligation with ethics and so forth to operate in the welfare and the well-being of our clients. And I'll share with you some of the little things that I've learned over the years later on, but it's very important to me that even though I have a, theological education background for many, many years, and was an ordained minister for many years, but now I'm on a different path that I can talk about if you want, but don't have to, is that we carry the message more than we speak the words of the message from that background that we come from, and that we allow people to have their own understanding and appreciate that. So out of seminary, my first job before I did my doctoral work was as a hospital chaplain. And one of the things that I began to learn, and I learned this in my education as well, is to honor where people are coming from and to recognize that we do not presuppose or assume people are of any particular persuasion when it comes to religion or spirituality, but to meet them where they are and respect that with all senses of dignity, not to project upon them our beliefs or attitudes or language that of where we're coming from, but to let our clinical skills and how we can meet them be the primary message that we carry. So I hope all of you can appreciate that effort that we will make today in looking at this. However, I do have some background that I want to present, and part of it comes from ethics. And this is from the Oklahoma Code of Ethics, but it's very, very, very similar to the American Counselors Association Code of Ethics. And this is going to be 2 slides, the background. So your state has exactly the same kinds of statements. In this regard, it says LPCs shall not, in the rendering of their personal services, participate, condone, or promote discrimination based on age, culture, disability, ethnicity, race, religion / spirituality, gender identity, sexual orientation, marital status, partnership, language preference, socioeconomic status, or any basis prescribed by law. LPCs do not discriminate against clients, students, employees, supervisees, or research participants in a manner that has a negative impact on these persons. So by saying that we are professionals, our licenses are by the states that we come from, we have an obligation to meet everyone where they're at. And this is right out of our codes of ethics across all state boundaries, and is very liberal, you might say, in its wording and in its application. So I want to use this in the next slide, and one more actually, from ethics to say that we want to be very mindful of what we're doing and to be consistent with our licenses and to respect people of where they're coming from. And we'll talk a lot about where we are as an individual and being on our own journey of how important this truly is to carry, the health, well-being, and hope that people need in the making changes in their life. From the American Counseling Association ethics, it also says under the section called competence, that LPCs and LPC candidates shall practice only within the boundaries of their competence based on their education, training, supervised experience, state and national professional credentials, and appropriate professional experience. An LPC or LPC candidate shall only practice in the new area when said LPC or candidate has received the necessary training, education, supervised experience, so on, and shall take steps to ensure that competence of work provided and protect others from possible harm. So I bring this up because I want to introduce is that some of us, for instance, may have been trained many, many, many years ago. And part of my training was in analytical psychology. So that hardly exists anymore at all as far as training programs go. But I was also trained in doing MMPIs and that kind of assessment tools or, testing. Well, so, but neither would I want to be testifying in a court, as regards to an MMPI. Even though I was trained in it and so forth, I don't use them. And two, I wouldn't want to put myself out there as being an expert or to know that. So I would just much want to limit myself in that capacity. But when it comes to people, talking about their faith, that's a very, very personal thing. And how one is informed of that. But at the same time, having spent 9 years of my adult life in theological education, am I competent to come from that perspective? Well, probably many of you would give me total permission to do so. But I think we want to look at it as being very humble and to realize that when we're talking about faith or spiritual perspectives, everyone is their own expert, And so people that, think things come from the Bible, half the time it's from Benjamin Franklin and not from the Bible. They really don't know a great deal. And we want to be very respectful that this is truth to them. And yet at the same time, I would not want to have an argument about constitutional law with a Supreme Court justice. And at the same time, it is amazing to me how people will argue about their religious or spiritual beliefs as if they know it inside and out. So it just shows us how personal it is to people. And they're not necessarily an expert in this area whatsoever. When it comes to studying theology and studying Greek and Hebrew, I found it very humbling to take a gentle look at the words that are stated and not be a literalist, because the Koine Greek, which New Testament is translated from, is by the way, the King James Version of the Bible was translated from the Latin. It's a very poor translation if you look at the Greek language, which is where it would have been originally written. So you just look at this and go, there's a lot here. And we want to be very mindful and careful in our presentation about what is competence in these areas of religion, spirituality / psychology, all wrapped together. So in my educational career, I was both a philosophy and religion major in college, theology in seminary for 3 years. And on top of that, I was in the counseling program and then spent many years, getting extra classes for my LPC licensure and supervision and so forth. So it's pretty fascinating that I spent a great deal of my life in 3 of the most difficult subjects that there are is theology, philosophy, and psychology. And I don't know where the point of competence is in those, because there's just levels of competence is what I'm saying, is that I spent a great deal of my life studying, in fact, my entire life, and yet what is truly competent. So being, for me, and what I'm going to present to you in our life, in our journey here today, is to be a lifetime learner and never accept that we know it all. Having taught at graduate school for counseling here at the University of Oklahoma, you know, I never would hesitate to just say I don't know when, you know, these incredibly bright grad students want to trip their professor up. Well, save your breath, because I don't know everything. And I'll tell you very quickly, I don't know everything. And so you may have some questions that we may have to explore, to study, or terminology that I'm not familiar with, that you read in some obscure article or research book or something. But that humility is very, very important, is to not know everything, but to be on our journey of living the questions of life, more importantly than knowing all of the answers, because I think I'm as educated in these fields as probably anyone is, and I just don't have a hard time saying I don't know. So in faith-based perspectives, when you look at it from a Christian perspective, and some of my education is what I'm really going to share with you here in the Christian background, is from this passage in Ephesians 4:32. It says, "Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other just as in Christ." And a student of exegesis and trying to find the meanings of things, I always resort back to the Greek, which is the original language that these things were not spoken in, but were written in, is that the word kind is kritotis in the Greek, and is most often translated as kindness, or the kindlier side of goodness. And then the little bit of a play on words happens here, is because that word Christ is Christos, which is translated as anointed. So Jesus Christ is not first and last name, by the way. It's Jesus, the anointed one, okay, the one who is designated. So it is not a coincidence then that these words have an implication of something like this, is that be you therefore Christ to one another, and using that word kindness and the similarity of it in the Greek to Christos. It is, you know, I hope and I believe a play on words that's very important, but gives us this foundation of what I hope to build on through this reference and one more that I'm going to make. One of the things that became very important to me in being a counselor, and I first learned it really through being a hospital chaplain, is to carry a sense of incarnational presence with us, that we are going to be the presence of hope, the presence of connection, whatever that might be, and let that carry us more than our vocabulary that might be full of religious connotations. And I found that this is just a safe and a practical way to approach people that you have no idea where they're really coming from. You know, are they a bedside Baptist? Are they a recovering Catholic, as many people have called themselves, or some other faith that I may or may not know anything about? And in this passage in Matthew 25:40, the answer to the question that is stated earlier is, "Truly I tell you, whatever you do for one of the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you did for me." So the question was posed earlier through the first statement, and in the question, "For I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. I needed clothes and you clothed me. I was sick and you looked after me. I was in prison and you came to visit me." When the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, thirsty and gave you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you?" So whatever you do for the least of one of these, you have done for me. So it's literally putting ourselves in that incarnational role of being Christ to one another, and let that being, you know, the way we carry ourselves from the Christian perspective. But another background that I happen to know a great deal about and study, and by the way, my teacher from Gaiden Shartse Monastery, a Buddhist monk who's the highest educated of all those Buddhist monks, is at my house. And he's been there for over a month, staying with us and doing teachings here in town. So I present you from Buddhism, the very same kind of perspective, which I think is common throughout the religions and throughout a spiritual perspective around the world. And from Buddhism, karuna in Sanskrit is translated as compassion and is seen as one of the 10 perfections in the paramitas. And in the four immeasurables, you'll see that that means immeasurable love, immeasurable compassion, immeasurable joy, and immeasurable equanimity, or treating one another with equal respect. And you'll see in that second one, immeasurable compassion is the word karuna in the Sanskrit word there. And the four immeasurables are translated something like this: may all beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May they be free of suffering and the causes of suffering. May they never be dissociated from supreme happiness, which is without suffering, and may they remain in the boundless equanimity, free from both attachment to close ones and rejections of others. So equality, seeing all people the same. So when you look at the similarities here, is that loving kindness and compassion, and be ye therefore Christ to one another, or be of service to others. You have this mission, you have this theological background that informs us, and it's a perfect connection of what we really do as counselors, is being there for others and treating them with that kind of respect and that kind of availability that they have someone to connect to. So one of the most common words today is tolerance. And I live in one of the most conservative states in the United States. And our state superintendent, as well as our governor, is going overboard to do away with diversity, equity, and inclusion programs at our universities. In fact, he made a governmental proclamation that our state universities could no longer spend state money on diversity programs in colleges. Every single department at the University of Oklahoma has a person hired to direct DEI kinds of initiatives. So I'm going to challenge us all to say, well, you know, maybe they're a little bit right, that the word tolerance is really not what we're after. And this is where it gets really into a theological perspective of practice, is that tolerance is defined as the ability or willingness to tolerate something, in particular, the existence of opinions or behavior that one does not necessarily agree with. And if you combine that with that Buddhist connotation of equanimity, at the heart, what it means is to have an eye, or to be in the growth stage of seeing, with that prefix of equanimity suggesting gazing upon or observing without interference, or in other words, without bias. So in other words, how does it feel for someone to tolerate you? How does that feel? To be tolerated? Yeah, so, you know, the word tolerance is, I think I know its original intent as far as diversity and inclusion and so forth, but when you really look at that word in the English, or how it feels for someone to tolerate you, it's not positive. It's not seen as positive. So we don't want to be tolerant of others. And if anybody else has anything to say, please chime in.
I was just going to say that I have a saying that I try to live by, and that saying is, I go where I'm celebrated, not where I'm tolerated.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. Yeah.
And I do my best to live by that. So
yeah.
if anybody here's tolerating me, I'm going to go. We'll see you later.
Yeah. Now, when it comes to our spouses or significant others, we do practice a lot of tolerance, don't we? Things that bother us, or things we do that bother them. We are gracious for that kind of tolerance kind of thing. But when it comes to interact, you know, someone said almost said offensive. Yeah. So we know when we're being tolerated. But then, how does it feel for someone to see you without bias? It begins to take on a little bit deeper and, inviting kind of connotation now. Celebrated, there you go, okay? For no reason at all, we might say, for no reason at all. But then, how does it feel for someone to see you with affection and kindness? And not be afraid of that, because affection, and this is the challenge, and this is where I really appreciate that equanimity part from Buddhism. And that word equanimity in Sanskrit has 5 meanings. So it's a complex word that carries a lot of connotations. But the challenge is for us to see all people with equanimity, with equality, but not just that, but with affection and kindness. Now, we're on a different plane now, right? I'm not just tolerating people. I want to be able to celebrate them for who they truly are. So to me, this is where, you can be as theological as you want to be, because I think this is the essence of where good theology comes from in application. And if it's not useful, then what good is it? It's piety, it's other kinds of words that are not always positive, but it's practical. And it is our mission and our calling through ethics to be a professional counselor, to be, one who's in service to others, or social worker, wherever you're coming from. The ethical guidelines are virtually all the same. So it's not to use the words, but it is how we behave. It is how we carry ourselves that is the essence of faith/spiritual perspectives, in the sense of recovery, is how we live our lives being on our own journey, which also means we're going to have to look at our own biases. And don't suppose for a minute you don't have them, because you're fooling yourself. We all were raised, we all have particular ways of seeing and thinking that we were raised with, that we injected, and we'll get into that in the second session this afternoon, or agreements that we've made about the nature of reality and so forth. Oh, by the way, on the 30 minutes of the hour, we'll take just a 5-minute break so you can stretch and so forth, then we'll finish up. And if I don't hurry up, we're not even going to come close to getting finished. So as we move through this further, I can get the slide to move. So when we think about defining best practices as being a counselor, it challenges us to move up to this higher level. It's not a profession. I don't believe that you and I are in a profession. It's truly a calling, and in today's world, it is a shamanistic kind of calling, is to be there for others, that doesn't really have many other outlets in our society for people to receive unconditional positive regard and help. Says, and this comes from Miller, the guy that Miller and Rolnick, the motivational interviewing guy. He says the development of evidence-based therapist is at least as much as, if not more important than, the dissemination of specific therapies. So in research going all the way back to about 1957, is that the therapeutic relationship, the ability to relate to our clients, is one of the leading components of the ability to make changes. Now, the readiness for the client is got to be number one, of course, and I think research has indicated that. But then secondly, is the therapeutic relationship is the force that creates, a major ingredient in the change process. The type of therapy you do is last, okay? Almost any therapy you do is effective if you carry it, if you are the message of reaching out, helping a person with this process of change. And so he goes on to say, and then I'm going to use him again 20-something years later as he refines this. says no amount of theory, coursework, continuing education, or on-the-job experience will lead to the development of experienced judgment. This requires superior performance. For that, it appears that practitioners must engage in the process of continuously reaching for objectives just beyond their current ability. So one of my favorite things to do is to supervise young counselors. Not only did I do that in grad school, but for their professional licensing. And so to watch them grow in gaining experience is where they really learn how to be a counselor. There is no way in 2 to 3 years of graduate school, in our wildest imaginations, are we equipping people to go be a counselor. It's the biggest pipe dream on the planet to think that that's possible. So when you see them start doing the work, you see them go through the process. And I think I'll be out in Portland in April, I think it is, doing 6 hours of a presentation on supervision, which is one of my favorite things to do. So not only do we need to be on our journey, our guide is to help young counselors and clients to be on their life journey. So then Miller, 2021, so what is that? 23 years later, says, what I had missed is the emphasis on the qualities of counselors and therapists themselves that improve clients' outcome regardless of treatment method being used. So he's, 23 years later, he's old now, right? He's re-examining this and saying the quality of the therapist is the most important ingredient that we're going to work with. Me being on our own life journey. Okay, so we often need to revisit and write things a little bit differently. And so he goes on to say, and part of this is his words, part mine, but 2 qualities that we know are best practices in therapeutic attitudes that help produce change. 1, compassion. There's that word. There's that Sanskrit karuna. The desire to alleviate suffering and facilitate others' wellness and growth. Gosh, that's the role of a counselor, right? To recognize suffering, what's the source of the suffering going on in people's minds. We have met the enemy and it is us. Now, lots of things happen to us in terms of trauma and so on and so forth, but how we carry that within us becomes what we really are working with. And then building partnership out of that sense of compassion, the full participation of our clients, with the belief, kind of a humanistic psychology beliefs, that human beings make their own choices about what they will do and how they will live, and efforts to persuade or coerce change can have an unintended opposite effect. So you might say that psychology is not evangelistic. We don't go around preaching change and trying to go to the highways and hedges and compel them to come in, okay? The change process is going to happen within the lives of the individuals. All we can do is be a sense of connection to help bring about that change process. And we'll talk much more about that neurochemistry of that happening as we go along through this presentation. So I'm getting behind on chat. Yeah, supervision, one of the most favorite things. Yeah, it's one of my favorite things to do. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Next slide. So again, one of the code of ethics things counselors are aware of and avoid imposing their own beliefs, values, attitudes, and behaviors. Counselors respect the dignity of clients, trainees, and research participants, and seek training in areas in which they are at risk of imposing their values on the clients, especially when the counselor's values are inconsistent with the client's goals or are discriminatory in nature. So one of the dreaded questions that I used to get when I was younger, and remember, this is Oklahoma, so it's very conservative, but when someone would come in and ask me if I'm a Christian or are you a Christian counselor, even rephrasing that, I can feel the chills on my neck, because my response is usually not going to satisfy them, because what people come in with that attitude wanting is affinity. They want harmony. They want someone that's going to speak this language to them that they're comfortable with. Well, not only do I believe is that necessary, but it's not even a role of the counselor, because we practice countering and helping people examine their own beliefs and so on and so forth. It's not about where I'm coming from that's going to be the change difference, as far as what I believe. If I'm Christian, Buddhist, Hindu, Jewish, it's helping evoke the best out of them. And so, I cringe. I just don't understand that. And yes, there's somebody out there that can help them, that's going to say the words that are pleasing to them. But what I've learned over the years, I'm not that person. Okay. I'm not him. So, and yet I'll be very, very kind and polite in giving that answer. But if you want me to use religious language, if you want me to quote scriptures and so forth, then I'm not your counselor. It's not how I carry myself, and so forth. And because the literal interpretations of things that are biblical can be very, very dangerous. And so are imposing, ethics, values, and morals on others, because we're here to help all people. And so, my judgment of the rightness or wrongness is not important. It's how do I help you find what's right for you? So my 9 years of theological education and the beginnings of, and then towards the end of that in pastoral counseling, some things I learned. And much of this was being in a hospital chaplaincy setting, is that there are many times I just do not have words to suffice the crisis that I am encountering. I'm thinking of a situation, and I've used this illustration many times, is that one of my rotations in the hospital was at the burn center. And I had learned enough about burn injuries to know that when it's a severe burn, they keep going. Okay, they go depth as time goes by. And that here I am visiting with a young man. Well, he was older than I was at the time, but he was young. He had a wife and several children. And this was in Guyman, Oklahoma, which is at least 6 hours away from Oklahoma City, where the burn center was. He was, matter of fact, in on a helicopter, and it was going to take his family 6 hours to get there. And I had learned enough working with these people that, for about 2 hours, 3 hours at the most, he was going to be conscious and talking to me, right? Then after that, he would go into a coma, he would go unconscious, and then a few hours after that, he would pass because it was severe. And what do you talk to a person about when you know you're the last person they're going to talk to just before they die? Well, we didn't talk about Jesus or God. We talked about what he does, his family, his love for people, life. He wanted to go hunting, You talk about those things, and you're there with them while they share their life story with you. I do not have the words that can suffice, that are magical, or to know that this man is dying in peace. That is up to him and how he has lived his life and so forth. But I want to be there in such a presence with him that he feels another caring human being is there, literally holding his hand or being there at his side, listening to him intentionally. So therefore, I'm being incarnational. I'm being that presence that he needs at that moment. And that's how I want to carry myself, is to be that presence, and not just in my work, but in my life. And that all the other people that I visited with that are all in the same hospital gown is to respect all people and convey that sense and that aspect of wholeness without using those religious terms. It is in how I carry myself in compassion and kindness that I want to carry this message. And be very aware, particularly in counseling settings, that the use of any sense of higher authority automatically gives an unequal relationship, of authority. And, because who's going to debate that? Well, you can argue with it, but it puts you in an adversarial role particularly. Another thing that I've learned along these years is that there are only wounded healers. We all have our wounds. We all have our weaknesses. We all have our Achilles heel, whatever that is for us. And through those spots on our body, which have healed over the years or in our psyche have healed, is where our relationship to woundedness comes out, that we know about life suffering, and we know how we all need kindness and compassion. And therefore, what we're doing is, in Martin Buber's terms, creating the I-thou relationship instead of the I-it relationship, and that we are meeting one another on this common ground of humanity and the suffering that we all go through. And another factor is relying on the who factor before how or what. And that is to be that unconditional regarding person that treats people with love and respect, that sees the best in people, that they will remember the who long after they have forgotten the what or how we said things. Is that the who? Be who to one another. So what constitutes being competent as a therapist? Well, I think I can describe that. But what constitutes being competent as a Christian, a Buddhist, a Hindu, or a Muslim? We're in a little bit fuzzier ground now, right? Because it's very individualized perspective, education, and so forth. So for me, the term humility must come into play, is that, I know a great deal. There's no doubt. And I'm amazed that people would want to argue theology with me that have not had an ounce of education in the field, or, state your faith, that's fine, but don't try to tell me what the Greek says or something else. But that's beside the point, okay? That's beside the point. I'm amazed at where we all come from in such perspectives sometimes. But I seek to be humble. I don't need to know everything. I don't have to tell you what the Greek word is for this, that, or the other. If you're a client, or the Buddhist word or whatever, that's pretty much irrelevant. What I want to be is be there. And so that's what we want to talk about, is that as we carry ourselves, being for one another is the most important religious/spiritual thing that we can do. I love this statement from The Death of Expertise. I think I heard this interview on NPR that says, "These are dangerous times. Never have so many people had access to so much knowledge and yet be so resistant to learning anything." And it is amazing how we have an entire segment of the population that negates expertise, in that they can believe anything they want in spite of the facts. In fact, they can create a term called alternative facts. What does that mean? That is just bizarre world. And this afternoon, when we talk, well, it's afternoon for me. The next session, when we talk about trauma, is that, what one of the key components of societal trauma is the inability to rely on truth, to rely on the facts. It creates uncertainty, and it's just amazing. So just think about this, is that, be a learner, be a student of life, don't become set. So there are 8 therapeutic schools schools perhaps, we want to talk about in terms of how we practice. Is like this: accurate empathy, we'll break all these down. Acceptance, positive regard, genuineness, focus, hope and expectation, evoking and offering information and advice. Now, this is not just, pie in the sky. This is as practical as it gets of what we do as therapists. And hopefully you can see how religious, how spiritual this list is, right? It's how we relate to other people with all of these characteristics, aspects, and ways of treating one another. Accurate empathy. And I love, it's interesting, the word accurate. So And this comes from Miller's book on that I'll show you at the end. Empathy can be increased by life experiences. So even if you didn't come from a background of learning how to empathize with others because of secure attachment, which we'll talk about later, or increased by intentional practice, one can learn how to be empathetic or understand the pain and suffering of other people. Or we can become hardened and defensive of our self-view or forget to practice empathizing with others. And that is, I can't think of anything more Christian, more Buddhist, more Hindu than learning to understand the suffering of other people. Just like me needs to be our mantra. People are suffering just like I suffer. So we have a connected identity with that. So as a young hospital chaplain, and I'm talking about, I think I was 24 at the time, 25 maybe 26, hadn't gone to graduate school yet. It often occurred to me, I've never had cancer, I've never had a heart attack, I've never been burned seriously in my life. What do I have to share with these people that have this life experience? I don't have their life experience. I cannot understand what cancer, I could not understand what heart attack or heart disease was or being severely burned. I had no life experience to tell me that. But what I did have was me to show up and be present and incarnational at that moment. So you don't have to have similar experiences to have empathy. It's to recognize the pain and suffering that's happening. So a central aspect of the skill is seeking to understand the client's perspective and experience. One of the things with young supervisees that I find is that they're so darn busy trying to do the intake and the assessment and, so some of the tests that they have to give and so forth, they don't see the person. They don't see the narrative of the person sitting in front of them, their story. That's what I want to hear when you tell me about this person. Who are they? Who is this person? I don't want to know their patient number. I don't want to know their room number. Who is this human being? How do they reveal themselves to you? Understand where they're coming from. So by seeking to understand the narrative, and if you're not familiar with narrative therapy, highly encourage you to look into it. And many years ago, in fact, my first trip to Evergreen Council to speak, I've been there over 20 times, so this was a long time ago. Mel Madronis, guys, he's got two last names. Does anybody remember this guy? Mel Madronis he's an MD speaking, but he wrote this incredible book on narrative therapy. Okay, so it's just one of those neat things to look at, is see the experiences and the suffering, the lack of direction, the struggle that people have, the need to blame others for how they turned out and so forth. So empathy helps us understand the client and focus on their well-being, which is a key recovery word, and helps in turn to resist inserting our own opinions, perspectives, advice, agreements, and disagreements early in the process. Understand with empathy. So roadblocks then to this kind of empathic listening, which is the requirement for empathy. So instead of probing, advising, assuring, and so on and so forth, empathic listening is mirroring, reflect back, being able to say as close to the client's own words as possible. That's so basic. Carl Rogers had it right all along, we haven't learned a lot in 40 years, really, other than what some of these people taught us. William James as well in 1906. Always monitor our own philosophy and perspective and not lead the discussion to our way of thinking or our vocabulary. Because what we're really saying is if you would only think or feel like this, then you'd have a different conclusion or a different outlook. No, they have their perspective. I'm here to understand that. Now, it's probably not working well for the person, but we'll get to that later. So empathy and good listening is this process of understanding the client narrative. What is their story? What ruminates in their mind while they're listening to you, their self-talk. That's what we want to know, because that's what's in the default mode network of the brain. The posterior cingulate right here on each side of the brain is where we carry our narrative. It's totally self-consuming. It's what dominates the subconscious if we're not focused on other things. It's repetitious and doubts about self, and it carries with it the conclusion of an incredible amount of shame, which is the fear of inadequacy. You're driving down the highway of life. It's a clear day. There's not many cars. You miss your exit. Where was your mind? It was in the default mode mechanism of ruminating. Why this? Why that? You were daydreaming, right? And it wasn't positive. Why'd that person do this? So the level of understanding is the ground of empathy and the filter by which we see the client's reality and develop relationship on that ground, okay? Because this default mode mechanism is in place by at least age 6. And particularly if there's trauma involved, it's going to operate in a particular way. We'll talk about that later in the second presentation. Acceptance. Acceptance is not a word. It's a way we carry and hold a crucible out, a bowl out, that we can put our concerns, let the individual put their concerns in there and hold it with care, okay? Treat it with compassion and care. And how you carry that is going to be read by the client, right? How you carry their concerns, all right? So we seek to do no damage. So by practicing acceptance, we practice non-judgmental, unconditional regard, and without acceptance, we cannot move through the stages of change. Now, the stages of change happen within the individual, but the atmosphere of the therapeutic relationship of acceptance creates that crucible, that possibility of change. Without it, not going to happen. You're not going to help people change by telling them what to do, cajoling them, degrading them, countering. It's not going to happen. Because when we see ambivalence and or resistance from the client, could it be as our approach? Could it be we're not practicing acceptance? Or we have to catch ourselves and, punt, come back? So when we learn to be mindful of what's happening without judgment and the content of our thoughts and feelings, or their content, thoughts and feelings, we're practicing acceptance, finding affirmations. Isn't it a miracle that with all the things that people have been through, particularly our addicted clients, they've survived, they're here? It's a freaking miracle. We shouldn't have a hard time coming up with some affirmations. They've survived against incredible odds. They shouldn't even be here the way they've behaved and lived recklessly, right? So shouldn't be hard to find acceptance through affirmations. So positive regard, I know this is an old term from Carl Rogers and so forth, but warm acceptance of a client's perspective, and not, warm acceptance. That's this thing of being spiritual. A genuine, warm liking, respect, and empathy. Now, it's a challenge sometimes, isn't it? I don't have to do it often, but when I have to counsel through an employee assistance program or something, a sex offender, I have to really watch myself, upon initial judgment. Now, after I get talking to the person and realize they're a human being in pain in their own trauma, I get over that real quickly. I'm not condoning what they do or how that expressed itself, but I have to realize they are a human being and come back to that point, because that's a bias, a very difficult thing to deal with. So it's our cognitive and emotional disposition that we're working with, and it's built in the sense of positive psychology as a humanistic kind of thing, that all people want happiness, positive virtues, and well-being. I love, some of the thoughts about the little country of Bhutan that does not have a gross national product index. They have a happiness quotient that they judge the well-being of their country by. Are people healthy emotionally, physically, socially, occupationally, intellectually, environmentally, and spiritually? Now, wow, What if we measured ourselves by such measures? Well, first of all, we would get an F as a country, no doubt about it, because consumerism and democracy, as in terms of capitalism, is not built on these things. But yet, here's the world we live in. So elicit this pursuit. We can help facilitate by wondering what gifts each person possesses. Do you know the magic of that? I don't have to know your gifts, but what if I wonder what your gifts are and let those evolve, okay? We also can help elicit this by the feedback, again, of affirmations and noticing and commenting on the person's strengths, positive attributes. They keep showing up. That's pretty positive, right? Okay, genuineness. Now, to me, all of these are of faith-based and spiritual perspectives, but this one particularly is being authentic. Now, being authentic doesn't always mean being transparent. We don't always reveal everything about ourselves, but what we do reveal within the therapeutic context comes through as genuine and authentic. And there's a difference. The opportunity to visit with a counselor who's also on their journey, a student of life in the subject of wholeness, a self-learner on the subject of their own inner self, and not be afraid of that. So transparency and clarity of the true self. Now that I can do, not my history, the ability to be self-aware while paying attention to the client at the same time. If you're supervising people, this is the highest level of supervision or expertise your young counselors can get to, is the ability to know what's happening with the client while at the same time know what's happening within myself. That's it, okay? Parallel. So we don't reveal our details, not important, okay? Aware of our own inner experience, our own journey, honesty, humility, grace, graciousness, okay? Be genuine. Don't have to know everything, just be genuine. So focus. And you see the term mindful. I heard a lecture one time by Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese Buddhist that came, protesting the Vietnam War, but spread, his version of the concept of mindfulness in the West, along with many others. But, he was teaching a course on mindfulness to therapists. And he said, I just love this because as therapists, you already know how to pay attention. And it's true. If you're a good therapist, you get incredibly focused on the other person, the mindful therapist, paying attention with single pointedness. That's called vipassana. Attention and to self and others. To be able to articulate is what, now I'm giving you Wiley Harwell here, not just Miller, but to articulate what is happening in the current moment. That should come with this. Keep our eye on therapeutic goals in the process of getting there, but recognizing, being empathetic with ambivalence, which is not resistance, okay? It's that there's a struggle with having to give up some things to get somewhere else. Ambivalence. Maintain neutrality. And remember to come back, reframing constantly. The client's goal is the objective, not mine. As a therapeutic skill in faith-based, spiritual-based things, we need hope. A hopeful attitude is optimism, anticipating, expecting positive change. We have the ability to carry that. People need hope. If you're dealing with gambling clients, people with a gambling disorder, they have bills they cannot pay. They have debt that is insurmountable. They're not going to get it paid off, probably. They can't see a way out of their problem, and they can't stop gambling. You think they need some hope? Wow. There's a way out of this forest. I know people that have done this. Let me connect you. So our hope, the hope that we can still instill, is the experience of witnessing others doing this many times before. Okay, I don't always know the way out of the forest, but I've observed many other people getting out of the forest, and let's talk about this. So, and make connections. And we learn to roll with that, defeatist attitude, that ambivalence. And it's not personal. It's never about you. It's never about me in that regard. This is what's happening within them because it's difficult. This isn't easy. So we want to say, small behavioral improvements, more presence as they stop the addictive behavior, they become more present. Their brain seems to be a little bit clearer. So it's emotional, psychological, mental improvements. We want to bring that out through those affirmations. And one of my favorite words is to be a therapist is to evoke, to bring out, to draw forth and support the strengths and wisdom the client already has. It's there. So it's been covered up, it's been masked, it's been drowned, it's been drugged, it's been through behavioral changes of the brain, washed away from my sight, but it's there. And maybe it's a belief that it's there. The true self cannot be destroyed. Now, I can live my life in such a way it's a far reach, but it's there. So express curiosity about what the client will do and the decisions they will make and what they made in other situations that were similar. So establish connection, because that is going to be a key part of the process and help bring out from the client the strengths, affirmations, and the pathway that is going to lead to health and well-being. And be able to give feedback. So, I can't say it enough of the role of the counselors to be a cheerleader sometimes, to observe, affirm, and even celebrate progress. You're sleeping. Wow, how long has it been since you've slept this well? Because their mind's settled. It's not on gambling all the time, right? They're not dreaming about it. Things are changing. And help, the consequences are highly motivating because until the consequences outweigh the chase of gambling or any other addiction for that matter, the change process doesn't start. But how long will the negative things like consequences last as motivation? Well, it's individualized, but not forever. But then the process of positively changing, the fruits of change have to take over and it becomes a positive motivation for change. Wow, life's better. So I can't say it's 6 months or 9 months, but I had one person that was a recovering gambler come to one of my trainings, and he had done some prison time for embezzlement due to his gambling and so forth. And he said to the other counselors in the room, never take our consequences away from us because we need them. And it's really true. But for lasting motivation, the consequences won't always be there for you. You'll justify, you'll rationalize, you'll forget, but you cannot then lose focus of the positive changes that you've made and then use that as motivation to continue the change process. So evoking, bringing this out of the client and noticing those words of change. So, and putting this into clinical skills from the spiritual/faith-based perspective, if you're not already aware of Louis Cozolino, highly encourage you to read his books on developing counselors and therapeutic process. He is out of Emory University. We had him, I don't know when, and along with a man named Philip Flores, who's also a PhD from Emory, on dealing with change process and addicted clients and so forth. But Louis Cozolino is one of the more inspiring professors I've ever read. So being a good therapist is equivalent to being a mindful individual living in connection with others. And, probably inspired by Louis Cozolino, but that's pure Wiley Harwell talking in that statement. So connected within ourselves, connected with others, living in connection with others, being mindful. And Cozzolino says, unlike other professions, being a competent therapist requires a simultaneous exploration of one's inner world and private thoughts. Sorely lacking in many current graduate programs is an emphasis on personal and emotional aspect of the therapist. So there isn't enough time in grad school to do it. There are some programs that require that becoming therapists are also in therapy. Hard thing for universities to require, some programs can, but it is one of the most sore lacking things I've seen. And when I was trained, 40 something years ago, you had to be in your own program of therapy and looking at yourself. Without this, I'm afraid we've got techniques and strategies. We got people that are relying on EMDR or some other technique as the sole and primary process of helping people. But so to connect with people, the comfort zone of it is working on your own self so that you do not shy away from the shadow areas, the darker areas, the trauma, whatever might have gone on in our life. If it is not examined and dealt with and found healing, those will be the areas we avoid in other people's lives, and it's subconsciously as much as consciously. So as Cozzolino goes on to say, for most students of psychotherapy, the primary challenge is not mastering the academic material. It is summoning the emotional courage to move through the inner space that leads to knowing oneself. The more fearless we become in exploration of our inner worlds, the greater our self-knowledge and our ability to help clients. What I told my grad students was every single one of them had a higher IQ than I do. And it was the truth. These people are bright, incredibly smart. What they don't have is 40 years of experience and self-examination to go with called clinical experience. That's the difference. Okay, what comes out looking like wisdom is just learned experience, right? And looking at my own self along the way. And so it is crucial to have that support and to be able to look at ourselves, because egocentrism comes naturally to us because of the way our brains process information, yet none of us feels that our perspective contains bias. The way we see things simply seems correct. The problem with the belief is that the vision of reality and sense of conscious control are mere illusions. Now, I have no idea if Lucis Cozzolino is a Buddhist, but that's a very Buddhist kind of statement, is that what we carry is our learned experiences within the posterior cingulate of our brain. We do not carry reality, we carry our perspective. We carry our learned experiences. It's our truth, it just isn't the truth, okay? We carry our truth, but not the truth. And remember, a lot of that is full of shame, fear of inadequacy, trauma, so on and so forth. We are guided and directed by, multiple unconscious processes of memory and emotion. This is not necessarily a character flaw, but a biological given that we have to accept. All we can do as children is adapt and adjust to what's happening around us. You do not have a choice. I suppose it would be nice at age 5 to sit back and be able to reason and say, these two people raising me are kind of freaking crazy, and I don't really have to listen to this or be like this. We don't have that ability. We have the ability, however, to adapt and adjust and try to survive. And unfortunately, or fortunately, that is our self-concept that we end up growing up with. There's those patterns of thinking, feeling, and doing the best we can with adapting and adjusting to what was happening around us. Our temperaments and personal histories create patterns of thinking and feeling that direct our behavior way, way outside of our awareness. So learning about personal, cultural, and humus, that's not a typo. That's a Greek word for self, one of the words anyway, or our biased sense of self, should be the primary focus of the training of every therapist. Us, okay? is to know ourselves. And we don't have to like it all, but we have to understand, and then we can give our clients permission, all that stuff that ends up in the posterior cingulates of our brain, our self-narrative, really isn't about you. It was about them. You don't really have to carry that around forever. You can begin the slow process of letting it go and see what's left and see where you're really at. So perhaps our jobs as therapists can be measured in how we help develop lifetime students of the life process. I'd a lot rather be measured by that than immediate outcomes. Those of you that work with individuals and families with a gambling disorder, if you're going to measure yourself by the outcome of abstinence of your clients, good luck. You're going to have so many failures. You're going to have so many people that return to it. Now, hopefully they don't in the long run, but you will get so discouraged you won't continue. It's a process. And keep with the process, and they will too. Hopefully they'll keep coming back. So because growth in and of itself is a lifetime process. So the competent therapist, the one on their journey, is continuously in the process of introspection and growth. The process of being a mindful individual that can facilitate this process and the work of therapy and help do that in the presence of another person. I love this comment. Remember, Spencer Johnson wrote all these neat little books, and one of them was Who Moved My Cheese? And Cozzolino comments on what's the difference between a rat and a human being? Well, if you move a rat's cheese in a maze after conditioning, the rat that would always go look in that particular place, he'll naturally look in that place, but then quickly go look for the cheese somewhere else. On the other hand, a human being will look for the cheese in the same place time and again because we believe it should be there or should have been there. Our human plight leads us to learn to get what we need where and when it is available, not where it should be, according to our beliefs. They already gave you what they had. You passed that window of time by the age you were 6. They didn't cheat you. They gave you what they had. Why is that so hard for us to accept? Because we're not rats. We're humans. It was supposed to be there. When we talk about trauma that later, not only does trauma get locked into the middle part of the brain, the limbic system, the age of the trauma does too, So then we look for that love, the old country song, in all the wrong places and all the wrong faces. You remember that one? Right? Looking for love in all the wrong places and all the wrong faces. We just transfer that to our intimate others or whoever to try to get that blessing. They gave you what they had. Now the blessing has to come from within, an acceptance of life as it is. You're fine. So that's our journey. So counselors learn to create the balance between the goals of therapy and the goals of the client. So we're helping them examine assumptions and beliefs, expand awareness, increase reality testing, those kinds of things we just talked about, aid in confronting anxiety-provoking experiences because they need help, a calm presence, that incarnation with them, and develop a new and more adaptive life narrative. So when I'm looking for it in the same place, it's supposed to be there, dadgummit. Why couldn't they? Why didn't they? You cannot bypass these questions. There are no spiritual bypasses to the psychological questions of life, the upsetness, the lack of connection. You have to go through the muck and the mire. We have to go through it with them. And yet, we don't have to get our shoes muddy. We've been down this road before. We know how to do this. And hopefully we've done it within ourselves. But here lies the problem, the formation of our own self-concept. The ordinary idle mind is the conditioned one that sees reality in a scripted manner based on our adaptations to environment and nurturing. It becomes the lens systems by which we see reality, by which we choose relationships, by how we conduct ourselves. As William James says in 1906, each of us literally chooses by his or her way of attending to things what sort of universe he or she shall appear himself to inhabit. This is long before anything of New Age came along, like you create your own reality. This was, basic psychology. The world you live in your mind becomes the world you see externally, and how you draw relationships to yourself to try to make up those differences, make life better, and so forth, without realizing those changes, that well-being now, after you've passed 6, isn't coming from the outside. It's got to come from within. But it takes connected relationships sometimes to bring that out, which is part of our role. So this formation of self-concept is very important to understand. Richard Davidson and Daniel Goleman, two people in the study of the neurochemistry of the brain, connectedness, relationships, mindfulness, and so forth, says one downside of the brain dynamic, we habituate to anything familiar. The pictures on the wall, the same dish night after night, even perhaps our loved ones. Habituation makes life manageable but a bit dull. Familiarity is the result of this habituation and one piece of evidence of our default mode network. The human disease that we're trying to help is familiarity. And even though we might feel life is dull, we'll go back to the familiar each and every time, the conditioned sense of self. And under stress, particularly when the cortisol is activated, where do we go? Back to our normal ways of trying to seek refuge or whatever that we're trying to find comfort from. But that's that old brain that is really, we've gone to the well a zillion times. It hadn't had any water. What are you going to do? Okay, you need help. We need help. But here's the problem. Your brain preferentially scans for, registers, stores, recalls, and reacts to unpleasant experiences. It's like, and this is the posterior cingulate side of the brain. It's like Velcro for the negative experiences and Teflon for the positive. Isn't that half the truth of us? If I sat down with each of you and gave you 5 affirmations, but one thing you need to work on tomorrow, what will you remember? The one thing you need to work on, the negative. It's the way the brain works. It was, this parts of the brain, particularly in the limbic system, was to keep us safe. So we stored all these negative things that could happen so we don't repeat them. The problem is we become that reality. We become that inadequate, that shameful kind of person that's storing up all this negativity and lets the Teflon, slide off all the positive ones. So the therapeutic process then is this. This is the 12 steps condensed to 5, okay? Recognition of what is happening in the body, mind, and emotions called our observer self. If we can teach clients to pause, observe the mind, observe the emotions, but let it pass, what happens is, in our default mode mechanism, we grab hold of all the thoughts, emotions, perceptions, whatever it might be, and we go over it and over it and over it. That's why the serotonin levels get all messed up. We need an SSRI to help level that kind of thing out. Recognition, what you're thinking, not judging it, not evaluating it, just recognizing it, first and foremost. Second level is acceptance. And there's many levels of acceptance. Of the learned mode, oh, there you are, and learn to treat it friendly. Oh, there you are, my judgmental friend that comes through my mind. Oh, there you are, dear one that is suffering, that always feels life is against you. Hello. There's room in the palace for all of these when I practice acceptance. When I let things go and cease identifying with them with practice of recognition and acceptance, they know it is a thought and a conditioning I have. It is not my reality with practice. So then we're practicing the 3rd step, let it go. Let it pass. The average usefulness of a thought and emotions, 11 to 12 seconds. Beyond that, you're hanging on to it. You're making yourself miserable. It informed you what it needed to tell you. Now, let it go. Come back to the breath, be present. Getting recentered in the present moment by continuing calm, abiding presence, which then is the emergence of that true self or the observer self that can observe life as it is, even my own thoughts without judgment, and let it be. And then fifth, you know you're working on these things when you respond to life with love and compassion, including ourself. And you go back tomorrow to step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Tomorrow, the next day, you go back. And once you repeat this, it becomes a pattern of observing what is happening, and we have that innate ability. Everyone does, but you have to practice. Getting people to practice is the difficulty. They want a prescription pad kind of therapist that gives them a technique, that gives them a pill that does all this. We don't live in the Western world of psychology, of medical world. We teach people to be skillful. So mindfulness then is the process that involves the skillful use of attention to both your inner and outer worlds. Since your brain learns mainly from what you attend to, mindfulness, a definition by Hansen and Medinas, is a doorway to taking in good experiences and making them a part of yourself, not just the negative. It is a conscious discipline. So therapy is this same process, the intentional cultivation of non-judgmental, non-self-referential, caring attention. There's plenty of room for it all. But if we repress it, we try to deny it, we try not to think, you will only think more. You will only do it again and again and again. It has to have acceptance. Causalino says, for those of us that study interpersonal neurobiology, believe that friendships, marriage, psychotherapy, in fact, any meaningful relationship can reactivate the neuroplastic brain in the processes and actually change the structure of the brain. This is our art as therapists, is connection. People change because of connection, because connection creates oxytocin. Oxytocin is the only natural rival to dopamine. Until people get reconnected to people, they will chase the dopamine effect. Oxytocin is not just for nursing babies and lactating mothers. It is any meaningful relationship that can be developed and trusted. The two components, key components of recovery are surrender and connection. This is Wiley Harwell speaking here, okay? Often seen as turning our life over to the God of our understanding, but it also can be more than that. It can also mean surrender to the fact that our addiction is stronger than our willpower, and you've got to get there. Willpower will not initially be able to help you change. It'll be your enemy. And surrender can also mean surrender to learning a new way of life. Connection, often seen in relationship to the God of our understanding, can also mean learning to connect with significant people because you're going to need them. Can also mean connect with life itself as the guiding force in our lives, but we have to be still to know what that is. It's there. So Daniel Stern reminds us that moments of genuine meeting, like we have in therapy, they happen. But the moment of meeting is the event that rearranges implicit relational knowing for both the patient and the therapist. If you don't want to be a therapist, if you don't want to be changed, I should say, don't be a therapist. Because you're connecting with other people changes you as well. You feel that aha moment when the connection happens. They do too. Richard Davidson, remember the guy that does the studies, instead the brain has a property called neuroplasticity, the ability to change its structure and patterns of activity in significant ways, not only in childhood, which is understandable, and not surprising, but also in adulthood and throughout life. This is our tool as therapists, is this magical thing called connection. All we can do is be on our journey, show up mindfully every session, and wait for the genie to show up, called the client's willingness to be connected with. We can't make it happen, but we show up each time ready for its happening and the event, because that creates neuroplasticity, oxytocin. And then Kathy Steele reminds us that if we pour then more information and interpersonal experience into that neuroplastic mind, it strengthens synapses, alters neural networks, and increases regulations all across the board of our neurotransmitters and hormones. And it begins to quiet the old rehearsed familiar neural pathways of the self, creates a pause, and allows room for something new. Philip Flores, also from Emory University, I told you about, says, until an addict, alcoholic, or gambler develops the capacity to establish mutually satisfying relationships, they'll remain vulnerable to relapse in the continual substitution of one addiction to another. So the process of abstinence and or change, or then a pathway of well-being, has to happen with this sense of connection along the way. And it's part of the 12-step process, because Paul Orstein says being understood as an adult has the same effect as being held as a child. Oxytocin. So individualistic versus the collective. So, and again, being mindful of not bringing Western concepts into our therapeutic process and not allowing one thing to merge into another. So as mainstream American values can dictate and prophesy by example and very loudly autonomy, self-determination, and becoming one's own person. And yet, that is being apart from. Other cultures, other people don't always see the sense of self as being apart from, but also, or more importantly, being a part of. So American culture is something we want to really not impose on others of different cultures, or even from a female perspective. So because our Western cultures tend to promote models of the self that emphasize personal control, the preeminence of individual rights and responsibilities. And I think we see politically the extreme of that today, that is way out of balance, of not considering how decisions affect other people. Our rights are more important than others, because indigenous and even feminist perspectives will more likely promote a different sense of the value of self. It's mutual interdependence, connection to others, and communal responsibilities. So, and I think good, healthy psychology comes more from not just building healthy egos, which to be ultimately healthy, you're going to have to let go of anyway, but to build mutual interdependence. So the broader social context of families, groups, and communities are often just as important as a cultural value, and even more so for many cultures than the independent sense of self. So mindful, again, from a Christian spiritual perspective, is balance and realizing people come from different places. Because if you just looked at the primary American culture, as Hogan did in 2013, it's a very difficult thing to do. What is American? What is, any one particular thing? You're stereotyping when you do any combinations of people, because we're all individuals. But there are some commonalities, that society and family should be a patriarchal nuclear family to stay busy as a value. we only deal with things that are measurable and visible accomplishments. Well, that's going to throw out psychology by and large. Well, much of the work that we do anyway. Individual choice, most responsible, responsibility and competition, rule of the day, direct communication, materialism, equality, informality, and fair play. So, just look at the values that are portrayed in any Western society, and you see that that may or may not necessarily be good, healthy psychology or good, healthy individuals or lead to well-being, because it's mainly based on individuality and what I attain, what I do, and not consideration of others. There must be a balance. But if you look at resilience, and this is always a fascinating subject for us that deal with trauma, which we'll deal with in the next section, is looking at what are factors that can help combat, the sense of trauma or adversity. It's the concept of resilience, to be optimistic, to learn or to develop a positive outlook. Very difficult in some cases. To be altruistic, the desire to help others, a moral compass, learn how to do the right thing, the next right thing, right? Humor, incredible tool for resilience. Having or had a positive role model. Social support, facing fear, a meaning and purpose in life, training and opportunity to learn resilience through competence. And add two more to it through a presentation of a colleague of mine at Baylor that worked with the Malawi grandmothers, widows, mainly from the AIDS epidemic back in the 80s, that were raising in huts small children that were orphaned because their parents died. Added, besides those qualities, compassion and creativity as resilience, okay? And teaching the kids how to do all kinds of cultural kinds of things, but incredible sense of compassion is resilience. And so we're going to end with this thing called mindset, of my idea that to do faith-based and or spiritual kind of emphasis, we have to be in the right mindset. And this comes from this author that's listed there at the top. Changing beliefs, the single hardest thing you do in psychology, and you don't do it directly head on, you do it through connected relationships, is changing beliefs may be the single most difficult thing to do, because many times it feels like a diminishment or a loss of ourself, of overcoming past things. Does an individual even see any need to make changes? Things are working fine for them because they're at the top of the ladder, they're in the privileged part of the population or whatever. And if there are changes, what would be better? So helping clients make changes is equally difficult, because we can't presume we know what the best changes are. So yet changing one's perspective of how you see reality may be the single most important thing that we can do and help people with. Like, why do I continue to look for the cheese or look for love in only one place? I'm expecting a 10 and always get a 2. How do I deal with that? Is it possible to change beliefs when the environment of the person feels helpless, dismal, and bleak, which many times our environments are like with our clients with a gambling disorder? Yeah, I've never seen, people that deal with so much adversity. They've created it. Yes, they have. But it's a mountain of things to overcome. So the questions: can human qualities and things such as intellectual skills be changed and or set? So this is just to challenge our original thinking all along. Think of the teachers you had from kindergarten through 12th, and I didn't even have kindergarten in my town. First grade is all we had, or at least maybe the wealthy people could do private kindergarten, didn't have public kindergarten, that treated you as if they already knew how smart you were, and those that treated you as if you were capable of learning. Did any of you have older siblings that went through the same school that you did? I had 2 of them. One was the valedictorian of her class. Thank God she was 10 years older than me, so a lot of the teachers didn't remember. The other sister was only 2 years older than me. But I can remember distinctly that when I had a teacher that it was because of the who factor, they treated me as if I was smart, I made an A. Those that treated me as if I wasn't smart, I made a C. I was entirely a social learner based on the connection with that person. But I'll never forget those people that treated me as if I was smart. I remember their names. I remember how they look. I remember how they made me feel. They treated me as if I was a capable learner. I produced. Beignet, the intelligence scale, said, who developed the intelligence test, he says, education and practice could bring about fundamental changes of intelligence. It's not a set factor, folks. You can become smarter. With practice, training, and above all, method, we manage to increase our attention, our memory, our judgment, and literally become more intelligent than you were before. I tell people all the time, without trying to brag, I finished 55 out of 105 in my high school graduating class. By the time I finished college, I got the award for the outstanding theology student. I don't know that's anything to brag about, but what happened? I had professors that treated me as if I was smart, as if I could learn. I increased. I became semi-intelligent, or on the road anyway. Gottlieb, eminent neuropsychologist, says not only genes and environment cooperate as we develop, but genes require input from the environment to work properly. The present-day guru of intelligence writes that the major factor in where the people achieve expertise is not some fixed prior ability, but purposeful engagement. It is not people that start out the smartest, but who end up the smartest. So if you apply this to psychotherapy, it is not those with the least problems that are going to do good in life. It's those that look at their problems and grow. It doesn't matter how many they have, okay? It's stay with the process. The view you adapt of yourself profoundly affects the way you lead your life. So the growth mindset is based on the belief that your basic qualities are things you can cultivate through efforts. Everyone can change and grow through application and experience. But, as the old saying goes, what's the definition of insanity? Doing the same things over and over again, expecting a different result. That's this posterior cingulate side of the brain going over and over and over the stuff we've already thought or learned and so forth. We have to stretch ourselves to be in the growth mindset. The fixed mindset, your qualities are carved in stone, which leads to a host of thoughts and actions. But the growth mindset leads to a host of thoughts and actions of aha experiences. There's something new and different. People with the growth mindset have or develop an ability to identify their strengths and weaknesses, and neither determines where they are headed. Getting some feedback there. Thank you. The growth mindset has the ability to turn setbacks into future success, because the addicted brain cannot learn from their experience, does not learn from their experience. They're going through the limbic system over and over and over again, separated from the prefrontal cortex. The growth mindset learns from experiences, successes and failures, and is able to learn from that. No matter one's current level of intelligence and or place in life can be changed. You can always change basic things about how you see things and who you are. This is not called positive thinking. This is diligent examination. The fixed mindset doesn't believe that basic things can be changed, and the basic sense of self is already defined. And I guarantee you, those are people of privilege that were born on the top of the heap that want to believe those things. The fixed mindset's always trying to prove they're right, believes the ability can be, and the growth mindset believes the ability can be developed through learning and connectedness and change. Therefore, the world becomes divided between those who are learners and those who already know. It's very difficult to help those people change. They're not asking for help. People in the growth mindset can then seek challenges. The fixed mindset think they already should know or do know and won't try for fear of failure. When the people with the fixed mindset opt for success over growth, they're really trying, what are they really trying to prove? Are they special, even superior, or money over growth, or whatever you want to put in there? Even in the growth mindset, failure can be a painful experience, but it doesn't define us. It's a problem that can be faced, dealt with, and learned from. John Wooden, the legendary coach of UCLA Bruins basketball, says, "You aren't a failure until you start to blame." What he means is that you can still be in the process of learning from your mistakes until you deny them or blame others for them. And so the growth mindset, yet what feeds it is that constant, endless curiosity and seeking challenge to put ourselves to the test. In the growth mindset, even leadership can be learned, and human development is more important than talent. The growth mindset believes in the concept of us and we, and does not center an organization or a family around the individual. Decisions are based on full and honest discussion, and the fixed mindset leader will surround themselves with people who will tell them what they want to hear, whereas the growth mindset will surround themselves with people that will, give them honest feedback and how things perhaps could grow, be better, or, holes that we did not see, maybe didn't want to see, but we need that honesty of looking at them. So I'm going to move through this very quickly. And this will be the last section that we'll have time to do. But addiction and that default mode, because that's part of what our presentation is about. If you don't know Judson Brewer, it's a name well worth knowing. His presentations online are good. He was at Yale at the time he did these writings. Now I think he lives in California, but the addictions and habits follow a pattern. There's triggers that lead to urges. Okay, triggers are visualization, sight, sounds, and so forth. Urges are internal biological changes that happen. Differences in neurochemistry and so forth. Behavior leads to the cycle of addiction, but then there's a reward, which is both internal, the neurochemical side, and the altering of how the brain is working, primarily driven by the limbic system. And once one is in this process, is bypassing the prefrontal cortex, which is logic, reason, consequential thinking. So the triggers are often elicited by a sense of stress or felt. Stress is cortisol. Cortisol is that stress response that wants and needs relief. So without the ability to have elevation of serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine, those things drop and one feels discomfort, ill at ease. Or our third criteria is anxious, irritable, and so forth, of the withdrawal symptoms of the person with the gambling disorder. So that leads then to wanting to increase those things, which goes back to preoccupation or the ritual of obtaining money, those kinds of things. The stresses can also then include, and triggers, family issues, children issues, marital issues, and the sense of boredom, which is experienced because of the differentiation in the neurotransmitting process, the dropping of the serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine. But then comes the behavioral, the ritual of getting ready to gamble, You got to have money, you got to have excuses, you got to have time, all of these things. Then comes the gambling event and the shift somewhere in the process into the default mode that now is conditioned to escape unresolved issues. So we shifted to the limbic system that has the gas pedal with no brakes, because the brakes would come from the prefrontal cortex, which has begun to shut down. The shift of the brain into default mode then chases levels of excitement and or to live on the edge. Different types of gambling would do one or the other, and also serves to escape the default mode of the brain, though all that negative thinking that we have, even though all that's happening in the same part of the brain, the trauma, the default mode, and the gambling activity or the addiction activity, it's a strange mixture all in there together. So then the reward that happens, the escape or the excitement, it accomplished that. The level of neurotransmitters that match the escape or the excitement are elevated. In gambling, you have wins and or near wins, so interpreted neurochemistry as a win. Anticipation of wins, there's more dopamine released anticipating a win than the actual win. And you actually have money in terms of credits, jackpots, chips. There's something tangible to it. There's a reward to it or not. So Brewer says, but if we can help people activate through all the things we previously talked about, the prefrontal cortex, the cognitive control tries to help us stop a negative behavior. I've had clients actually talk about standing in line at the ATM machine to get more money, having a prefrontal cortex versus limbic system conversation with themselves. Oh, continue to gamble, just stay here. Oh, you need to go to the store and pick up bread and milk and go home. Prefrontal cortex and limbic system are having a conversation. It's not integrated, it's separated. The prefrontal cortex isn't being strong enough to help the limbic system go home, buy milk and bread and get out of there. Because when we have stress, the cortisol, the first thing to go offline is the prefrontal cortex. So when we fall offline, we're more likely to fall back into those preconditioned habits. And so becoming really conscious of what we are experiencing allows us to actually feel disgusted, disappointed, without necessarily having it to be shame with our behavior and on a very visceral level. Now, this must happen somewhere in the change process. To actually become upset at oneself on a visceral level for continuing this kind of behavior because of the consequences and so forth. This is what is going to happen. Now, we're not trying to feed this, but individuals come to this themselves. But now, combine that with mindfulness. Be curious about what one is experiencing, especially at the level of triggers, and try to back this up before it becomes urges, and even at the level of stress. Because when triggers turn into craving, it's almost too late. We're experiencing fear and want to relieve that emotion. So we have to give people skills to back mindfulness up to the stress and to the triggers point of view before it becomes urges. Because the default mechanism in that post-cingulate parts of the brain, which carries our self-identity, also wants to resort to soothing itself instead of continuing to be stuck in those unhealthy ways of thinking. Does that make sense? I hope so. So we're trying to bring out something else. In other words, with addiction then, that learning biases the brain and the mind. With learning, conditioned responses gain greater weight over other possibilities. So it's like you're looking at a wall with 100 drawers that you could see what's inside, but you always go to the same drawer, your conditioned response, to see what's in there. There's 99 other freaking drawers to pull out, but you only go to the one, your old behavior, your old pattern, your old addiction. Let's see what else is there. Because the problem is, we already said, this is a repeat because it's very important to me. Remember, that part of the brain's Velcro for the negative, Teflon for the positive. It's what it does. Don't be critical of it. Don't try to judge it. Don't shame it. That's just what it does, and recognize It has a function. But what we want to see is related more to internal family systems kind of work of the 8 C's of the true self, that what we want to help elicit are the times in our lives or in our clients' lives when the true self is operating, which is the seat of our consciousness, and at its core encompasses these things: curiosity, compassion, calm, confidence, courage, clarity, creativity, and connectedness. So remember, when we're visiting with people, they're not in their addiction all the time. Notice when these things come out in their words. The true self is always there, and learn to enhance this and bring this out with more and more confidence. And that brings us then to mindfulness, to be aware with non-judgmentalness, and then this other meaning of equanimity with even-temperedness, even in stress, awareness of what is happening as it's happening, and the ability to describe it with words. Then in turn, as we practice these things, we teach our clients, then they can actually become more flexible instead of driven towards that old addictive pattern. They can adapt to the new ways of learning. They actually can understand instead of saying, well, I don't get it. They become more energized and as a result, more stable. Okay? So I've got to end with this last quote. Joseph Campbell: the hero, the heroine, is symbolic of that divine, creative, and redemptive image which is hidden within us all, only waiting to be known and rendered into life. There you go.